When does a mother's love become an assumed privilege in the eyes of her child? During a family gathering, a daughter confidently claims her mother's house with a simple sentence, "Mom, this house is ours." She doesn't ask. She declares. And she believes that her 9-year-old mother, as always, will endure it and accept. The entire room silently agrees, waiting for the mother to nod. But tonight, that silence means something else. It isn't agreement, it's anticipation. The anticipation of a truth about to be unleashed that will leave everyone stunned. If you had to sacrifice to protect your own dignity, would you be willing to risk your family ties? Part 1. The Silence Before the Storm. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 69 years old, and my daughter, my only child, has just told me that the house I bought with the last of my husband's life insurance is hers. This house is ours. Mom, she says, her voice ringing with the kind of certainty only the young and entitled can possess. So, you need to start acting like it. Ours. The word hangs in the air of my new living room. It's a small word, but it feels like a physical thing. A stone thrown right at my chest. There are 20 people in this room. All of them from my son-in-law's family. All of them watching me. Their eyes are on me. Waiting for me to argue, to cry, to do what I have always done, to fold. Jennifer stands there, her hands planted on her hips, a queen surveying her new territory. She is waiting for an answer, but today, something is different. I can feel it deep in my bones. A cold, hard thing that has finally taken root where 2 years of grief used to be. I look at her, the baby I once held in the crook of my arm, and I say nothing. I simply hold her gaze, and in the silence that follows, the long, terrible silence where you could hear a pin drop, I let my mind do what it does when the present becomes unbearable. It flees. It flees back in time, back to just 3 days ago, back to when this house was still a promise. 3 days ago, I stood right here, in this exact spot. But I was alone. The morning sun streamed through this same large window, but then it was painting stripes of hope across the bare oak floors. Outside, the Georgia pines stood tall and silent, like old sentinels guarding my peace. I ran my hand along the cool plaster of the wall, and for the first time since my James left me, I felt like I could breathe again, deeply, all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. This little house, nestled at the end of a long gravel road, was mine. You understand what that means, don't you? After 45 years of being a nurse, of tending to others, of soothing fevers and holding hands and cleaning up messes that weren't my own, it was finally my turn. My turn for a little quiet. My James, he always knew I needed it. He'd come home from the plant, smelling of grease and hard work, and find me slumped at the kitchen table. He'd hold my hand, his thumb tracing slow, comforting circles over my tired knuckles. He'd say, "Ellie, you've taken care of the whole world. It's time the world took care of you. And if it won't, then I'll make damn sure what we have will." And he did. He made sure of it. That first morning, I had unpacked a box of my favorite mugs, the chipped and faded ones that held more memories than coffee. I placed James's worn leather armchair by the window, right where the sun was warmest. I imagined myself sitting there, a cup of tea in hand, a good book in my lap, watching the seasons change. This wasn't just a house. It was the final chapter of my life. And I intended to write it in peace. Everything was perfect. Everything was mine. Then, the telephone rang. Its shrill cry cut through the beautiful silence. I saw Jennifer's name on the screen and I smiled. A real smile. The kind a mother saves for her only child. "Hello, my darling girl," I answered, my voice full of that foolish, hopeful joy. "Mom, get ready." Her voice was rushed, breathless, not with excitement for me, but with that frantic, commanding energy that always preceded a storm. "I'll be there in an hour." With 20 people from Michael's family, the world tilted. I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter. 20 people, Jennifer. I just arrived. I have nothing prepared. I don't even have enough food. "Oh, Mom, don't be dramatic." The words were like a slap. "It's vacation time. and they needed a free place to stay. Your new house is perfect. My house. My quiet, two-bedroom house. But Jennifer, my voice was a thin, trembling thing. I don't have space. There are no buts. Mom, shitter. She cut me off. Her voice sharp as glass. We are your family. You have an obligation. Besides, why did you buy such a big house if it wasn't for us to use? Don't be selfish. We're on our way. So hurry up and get everything ready. Then came the final instructions. Delivered like a general. Oh, and make sure there are enough clean towels. And prepare some food for the ride back. See you. She hung up, just like that. I stood there. The silent phone pressed against my ear. A low buzzing sound in my head. And I felt all the peace. All the hope. Drain right out of me. Leaving that hollow, familiar ache in its place. The smell of fresh paint suddenly seemed cloying. The sunbeams on the floor felt cold. My sanctuary, my final chapter, was about to be invaded. And I, as always, was expected to simply open the gates and smile. Part 2, The Invasion. The silence didn't last. It was shattered by the crunch of gravel under tires, not one car, but a whole fleet of them. 4 oversized SUVs. Looking like a presidential motorcade arriving at my little country house. I stood frozen by the window, my hand still on the cool plaster. As the doors flew open and the horde descended, it wasn't an arrival, it was a breach. 20 people. 20 loud, boisterous strangers spilled onto my freshly mowed lawn. Suitcases were dropped like anchors on my porch. Children, squealing with the boundless energy of the recently uncaged, immediately began chasing each other through my nascent flower beds. A cacophony of voices, all talking over each other, filled the quiet Georgia air that I had, for a few precious hours, called my own. Jennifer and her husband, Michael, were at the center of it all. Not as guests, but as masters of ceremony. Aunt Carol, you and Uncle Gene can take the guest room, Jennifer directed, pointing toward the hallway without so much as a glance in my direction. Kids, the loft is all yours. Just don't break anything. Everyone else, find a spot. We'll make it work. We'll make it work. Not Mom? Is this okay? Not, let's ask your mother where she'd like people to go. I felt a strange sense of dissociation, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. I saw a woman, me, standing uselessly in her own doorway. Michael strode past me, clapping me on the shoulder with a familiarity that felt more like a claim of ownership. Ellie, you're a lifesaver. The family was desperate for a getaway. He didn't wait for a reply. Already busy directing his brother to park a cooler full of beer on my antique coffee table, the one that had belonged to my mother. A wet ring formed on the wood instantly. The first hour was a blur of motion and noise. I became an invisible servant. Is there any iced tea? Someone asked the air. And my hands automatically went to the kitchen. Where are the extra blankets? A voice echoed from upstairs. And my feet carried me to the linen closet. I moved through the chaos. A ghost in the machine they had created. They laughed. They ate the sandwiches I frantically threw together. And I was just a shadow in my own home. The first crack in my composure appeared that afternoon. I had finally managed to get a moment to myself, sinking into James's worn leather armchair by the window. It was the one piece of furniture that felt like him. Like home. I closed my eyes, trying to find that feeling of peace from the morning. But it was gone, buried under the weight of 20 uninvited souls. Mom, what are you doing? Just sitting there. Jennifer's voice sliced through my momentary reprieve. I opened my eyes to see her and Michael dragging the armchair away from the window. My voice came out as a strangled whisper. What are you doing? That's your father's chair. Jennifer grunted with the effort of moving it. I know. Mom, we need the space. This is the best spot for the poker table tonight. She patted the arm of the chair as if it were a disobedient dog. We're just moving it out of the way. To make room for our guests. Our guests? There was that word again. Ours. She didn't see a memorial to her father. She saw an obstacle. A piece of furniture that was in her way. That's when the grief that had been my constant companion for 2 years began to curdle. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was a slow, Simmering anger, hot and unfamiliar, bubbling up from a place deep inside me that I thought had long gone cold. I watched them shove my husband's memory into a dark corner, and I said nothing. But this time, my silence wasn't born of submission. It was the silence of observation, of calculation. I was no longer just a grieving mother, I was a witness. That evening, I cooked. I cooked until my back screamed and my feet were swollen. In a kitchen, still half-packed in boxes, I produced a meal fit for an army roasted chickens, a mountain of mashed potatoes, green beans, salads, and biscuits. I emptied my new pantry, using up the provisions I had hoped would last me a month. I shuttled plates and refilled glasses, navigating the crowded dining room like a waitress in a diner that had suddenly tripled its capacity. They ate like wolves. Food disappeared. Wine flowed, and the volume rose to a deafening roar. I finally sat down at the far end of the table with a small plate, but no one seemed to notice. I was just part of the scenery. As the meal wound down, I heard Michael's Aunt Carol, a woman with a perpetually sour face, push her plate away and announce loudly, "It was decent, I suppose. A bit plain. You'd think for a spread this big, there'd at least be some dessert." Michael chuckled. "Now, Carol, give her a break. She did her best. She did her best." Like I was a child who had brought home a clumsy drawing from school. The simmering anger in my chest flickered, threatening to become a flame. I looked across the table at these people who had invaded my home. My peace, my life. They weren't family. They were locusts, devouring everything in their path and complaining that there wasn't more. And my own daughter, my Jennifer, was their queen. She sat beside her husband, beaming, accepting compliments on her beautiful new country home. Later that night, long after the last of the poker players had stumbled off to whatever corner they had claimed, I was left with the wreckage. Plates piled high with half-eaten food, empty bottles, and sticky glasses covered every surface. A film of grime seemed to coat the entire house. The exhaustion was so profound it felt like an illness. As I was carrying a trash bag out to the back porch, I heard voices from the master bedroom, my bedroom, which Jennifer and Michael had taken without asking. The window was cracked open to let in the night air. Their voices were low, sharp, and laced with a tension that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't the happy chatter of a couple on vacation. It was the sound of a fight. I froze in the shadows of the porch, the trash bag clutched in my hand. "Can't keep putting them off." Jennifer's voice was a venomous whisper. That last call was a final warning. If we don't have the payment by the 1st, they're going to start the proceeding. And what do you want me to do? Jen magic the money out of thin air. Michael's reply was heavy with desperation. "The business loan is shot. My credit is maxed out. We have nothing. We have this," she hissed. And I knew. I just knew. She was talking about my house. "This is our last chance. It has to work." A pause. The crickets in the yard seemed to be holding their breath. "It feels wrong," Michael said, his voice softer now. "She just bought the place. It's all she has left of her dad's money. Don't you dare get sentimental on me now." Jennifer snapped back, her voice turning to steel. "It's not wrong. It's practical. Think of the kids. Michael, think of our future. They're going to take everything we have if we don't do this. This house is the only thing that can cover the loan." A cold dread, colder than any grief I had ever known, washed over me. It seeped into my bone, turning my blood to ice. "She'll never agree to it," Michael murmured. Then came Jennifer's reply, uttered with a chilling finality that stopped my heart. "She doesn't have to agree. She just has to sign. And she will. After this weekend, after she sees how much the whole family loves our new house, she'll do the right thing. She has to." I stood there in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of pine trees and the ruins of my dinner party. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture so ugly, so monstrous. It stole the air from my lungs. This wasn't a vacation. This wasn't a family get-together. It was an ambush, and I was the prey. Part 3. The Breaking Point. The next morning, the house smelled of stale beer and entitlement. I woke before anyone else. my body aching from a night spent contorted on my own lumpy sofa. My bedroom remained occupied by the king and queen, and every other horizontal surface, including the guest bed and several large air mattresses I didn't even know they'd brought, was filled with their snoring court. I felt like a refugee in my own sanctuary. I cleaned the wreckage from the night before, my movements slow and robotic. The anger from the previous night had cooled into a hard, heavy stone in my stomach. I had heard their plan. I knew what this was. But knowing and knowing what to do about it were two very different things. They began to trickle downstairs around mid-morning, demanding coffee, asking what was for breakfast as if I were the proprietor of a bed and breakfast. I pointed to the cereal and the milk, my voice a dry rustle of leaves. Help yourselves. It was Michael who dropped the bomb. Just after noon, he found me on the back porch, trying to scrub a wine stain from the wooden decking. He leaned against the railing, blocking my son, a wide, disingenuous smile on his face. Ellie, we've had a fantastic idea, he began, his tone dripping with false bonhomie. The family is having such a great time. We were thinking, to cap off the week, we should throw a big farewell barbecue on Saturday. Ribs, steaks, the works. I stopped scrubbing and looked up at him, my hand frozen. I said nothing. He took my silence as encouragement. The thing is, we're a little short on cash this week. So, Jennifer and I were thinking. He paused, his smile becoming a little tighter. Mom, you'll need to go to the bank and take out some money. A few hundred should do it. We need to get everything ready for our party. There it was. So blunt, so shameless. He wasn't asking. He was instructing me to use the last of my husband's money, the money that had bought this very house he was plotting to take to fund a party for his family. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up my neck. I felt my vision swim. I looked past him, toward the living room window, and saw Jennifer watching us, her arms crossed, nodding her approval. My daughter, I finally found my voice. But it was a stranger's. I'll see what I can do. That night, I didn't even try to find a comfortable position on the sofa. I just lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to the house breathe with the lives of people who were slowly, methodically, erasing me. I felt the last of my fight drain away, leaving only a vast, hollow emptiness. I was 69 years old, and I was utterly, completely alone. And in that despair, I drifted off to sleep, and I saw James. He was standing in the doorway of our old bedroom, the one we shared for 40 years. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old and sick either. He was just James. Strong, is steady, his hands clean of the grease from the plant. He wore his favorite flannel shirt. He didn't speak. He just looked at me. And in his eyes, I didn't see pity for my plight. I saw disappointment. It wasn't a cruel disappointment. Not an ounce of I told you so. It was a deep, sorrowful disappointment for me. It was the look of a man who had worked his entire life, stacking every extra dollar away, making damn sure his Ellie would be taken care of, only to see her letting herself be trampled into dust. He had built me a fortress, and I had simply handed the keys to the invaders. I woke with a gasp, my cheeks wet with tears. The dream was gone, but the look in his eyes was burned into my mind. The hollowness inside me was gone. In its place, a cold resolve began to form, solid as ice. The grief was still there, a constant companion. But now it had a purpose. It was no longer a weight pulling me down. It was fuel. I slipped out of the house before the sun was fully up. The morning air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stale atmosphere inside. I just needed to walk, to feel the solid ground under my feet. As I rounded the bend in my gravel road, I saw a woman my age tending to her rose bushes in the yard of the neighboring house. She looked up as I approached, her face weathered and kind. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm. She wiped a gloved hand on her apron. "I'm Betty Cooper. Looks like you've got a full house over there." Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing of the fleet of SUVs and the general air of chaos. "Eleanor Vance," I replied. "Yes. A family visit." She gave a knowing, tight-lipped smile. She looked from my house back to me, taking in my tired eyes and the tension in my shoulders. Then she looked up at the rising sun, a brilliant orange orb painting the sky. "Well," she said, turning back to her roses. "Good morning. Don't let anyone dim your sunshine." That was all she said, but the simple words struck me with the force of a thunderclap. Don't let anyone dim your sunshine. James had spent his life trying to make sure I had sunshine, and I was letting them plunge me into darkness. I walked back to the house, each step more certain than the last. Betty Cooper's words and the look in James's eyes swirled together in my mind, hardening my resolve into something unbreakable. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a ghost in my own home. I was a warrior who had just been handed her sword. I entered the house to the familiar morning chaos. Jennifer was directing her cousins on where to find the coffee filters, while Michael was on the phone, laughing loudly. I walked right into the middle of the kitchen, and the room quieted slightly. 20 pairs of eyes turned to me. I cleared my throat, my voice steady and clear, devoid of the tremble it had held for 2 days. "I need to go into town this morning," I announced. Jennifer's eyes lit up, a greedy little spark I now saw with perfect clarity. She thought I was going to get her party money. "I have to sort out some paperwork at the bank." Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you had to stand up, not just for yourself, but for the memory of someone you loved? I would love to hear your story. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the like button if my story speaks to you. Now, come with me into town. Part 4, The Trip to Town. The 10-mile drive into town felt like a cross-country journey. My old sedan, usually a source of comfort, felt like a cage. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white mountains on a wrinkled map. With every mile that passed, the cold resolve I had felt at dawn began to fracture, giving way to the insidious whispers of doubt. Am I overreacting? The question looped in my mind. A tormenting refrain. She is my daughter, my only child. Maybe I'm the one being selfish. Maybe this is just what families do. I passed the turnoff for the First Community Bank. Its cheerful sign, a stark contrast to my grim mood. Jennifer would be expecting me to walk through those doors, to withdraw the money that was supposed to be my safety net, and hand it over for a party I didn't want in a house they were trying to steal. The thought was so absurd, so deeply wrong, that it felt like a scene from a different life. Am I being a bad mother? My foot eased off the gas pedal. James had loved Jennifer fiercely. He would have given her anything. Was I betraying his memory by drawing a line in the sand, by refusing to give? But then I remembered the look in his eyes from my dream. It wasn't about giving, it was about protecting. He hadn't worked himself to the bone so I could be a doormat. He hadn't saved and sacrificed so I could be a convenient solution to my son-in-law's financial irresponsibility. I took a deep breath, turned left onto Oak Street instead of right, and drove toward the Old Town Square. I wasn't going to the bank. I was going to a small, brick-fronted office with the words Caldwell and Sons, attorneys at law painted in faded gold leaf on the glass door. I was going to see a man I hadn't spoken to since James's funeral. Arthur Caldwell's office was a time capsule. It smelled of old paper, leather, and faint lemon polish. The wooden floors creaked a welcome, and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner was a steady, reassuring heart. Arthur, a man now as old as his furniture, greeted me with kind, watery eyes from behind a desk, cluttered with a lifetime of secrets and promises. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a gentle rumble. "It's been too long. Please. Sit. Coffee." "No. Thank you." "Arthur," I said, my voice more steady than I felt. I sat in the worn leather chair opposite him. "I'm sorry to come without an appointment." "Nonsense. For you, my door is always open." James made me promise. He leaned back, his expression shifting from neighborly warmth to professional focus. "What's on your mind?" I told him everything. The words tumbled out: the invasion of my home, the talk of our house, the overheard conversation about the loan, the demand for party money. As I spoke, I felt a familiar shame, as if I were betraying my own daughter by speaking the truth. Arthur listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, not interrupting once. When I finished, The only sound was the ticking of the clock. A heavy silence settled in the room. I felt exposed. Foolish. Maybe I was just a crazy old woman. Finally, Arthur leaned forward, his gaze direct and filled with a profound sadness. Eleanor, I wish I could say I was surprised. Your husband, James, was a wise man, a very wise and far-seeing man. He swiveled in his chair and pulled a thick, leather-bound folder from a filing cabinet behind him. The name Vance, James and Eleanor, was neatly typed on the tab. He placed it on the desk between us. James came to see me about 6 months before he passed. Arthur continued, his voice low. He was worried. He said to me, Arthur, my girl Jennifer, I love her to pieces. But she has her mother's kind heart and her husband's calculating head. That's a dangerous combination. He was afraid that Michael's ambition would one day put Jennifer in a position where she would see you not as her mother, but as a resource. A sob caught in my throat. He had seen it. James had seen it all coming. He made me set something up. Arthur said, tapping the folder, he wanted to make sure you were protected. He wanted to ensure that you, and only you, always had the final say. He opened the folder, and the air left my lungs. It wasn't just a deed. It was a thick stack of legal documents. This house, Eleanor, is not just in your name. It is the sole asset of the James T. Vance Irrevocable Trust. You are the primary beneficiary and the sole trustee. What that means, in simple terms, is that you have complete and total control over this property for the rest of your life. It cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without your explicit, written signature. No one can force you out. No one can claim ownership. Upon your passing, the trust dissolves and the property passes to Jennifer, as James wished. But until that day, this house is your fortress. Legally, it is untouchable. Tears began to fall, rolling silently down my cheeks and dripping onto my clasped hands. But these were not the tears of weakness I'd shed on the sofa. They weren't tears of grief or humiliation. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. Each drop washed away a layer of the fear and doubt that had plagued me. James hadn't just left me money. He had left me a shield. This document, this folder, was his last love letter, written in the cold, hard language of the law to protect me from the one person he knew I would have trouble protecting myself from. Arthur pushed a box of tissues across the desk. He loved you very much, Eleanor. He just wanted to make sure your sunshine couldn't be dim. I took a deep breath and wiped my eyes. When I looked up at Arthur again, the frightened, uncertain woman who had walked into his office was gone. The ice in my gut had reformed, no longer just resolve, but a diamond-hard certainty. I finally had my footing. I finally had my weapon. Arthur, I said, my voice clear and strong. Could you make me a copy of the trust summary page, the one that names the sole trustee? He smiled. A genuine, proud smile. I'll do you one better, he said, reaching for the phone. I'll have it notarized. As I walked out of that office and back into the bright afternoon sun, I clutched the folder to my chest. It felt solid. It felt real. It felt like my husband's hand in mine. I knew exactly what I had to do. The performance was over. It was time to bring down the curtain. Part 5. The Calm Before the Battle. I didn't drive straight home. The notarized document on the passenger seat felt as heavy as a block of gold, radiating a quiet, powerful heat. My hands were still trembling slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the adrenaline of revelation. I saw a small, public access road that led down to Lake Lanier and, on impulse, I took it. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and just sat. The midday sun danced on the water, sending 1,000 glittering diamonds across the surface. I sat there, in the silence of my old sedan, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could hear myself think. The roar of 20 invaders, the sharp sting of my daughter's words, and the crushing weight of my own compliance, it all faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I placed the folder in my lap. It was just paper and ink, but it was also a shield, a legacy, and a final lesson from my James, staring at his signature on an old letterhead inside. My mind drifted back, years and years ago, to when I was a young nurse, barely a year out of school, a senior surgeon, a man with a god complex and a notoriously short temper, had wrongly accused me of a medication error in front of an entire ward. I had been humiliated, frightened, and furious. I came home that night in tears, ready to quit. James had listened, as he always did, letting me pour out all my rage and frustration. When I was done, I expected him to rage with me. Instead, he took my hands in his and said something I never forgot. "Ellie, don't you ever scream at a bully? They love that. It's the noise they're looking for, the proof that they've gotten to you. They feed on the chaos." He squeezed my hands. "You want to beat a man like that, you look him straight in the eye. You speak the truth in a voice as calm as this still lake. And then, you go silent. The silence after the truth is spoken, Ellie, is more terrifying to them than any shout could ever be. It's the one thing they can't fight." The next day, I walked up to that surgeon, requested a private word, looked him in the eye, and calmly presented the patient's chart which proved my innocence. Then, I just stood there, waiting. The silence stretched. He sputtered. He blustered. But he couldn't meet my gaze. He never bothered me again. A slow smile spread across my face. There, in the quiet of my car, my husband had given me the strategy decades ago, and Arthur Caldwell had just handed me the ammunition. The pieces were all there. My daughter and her husband were bullies. They were banking on my grief, on my love, on my lifelong habit of folding. They were expecting tears or shouting. They were expecting a fight they knew how to win. I wasn't going to give it to them. My plan began to form, sharp and clear, like a photograph coming into focus. I would not storm into the house, waving the papers, declaring my victory. No, that would be too easy, too messy. I would employ a twist of my own. I would let them stage their final act. I would let Jennifer have her moment. Let her stand before her audience and make her grand pronouncement. I would let her believe, for one shining, triumphant second, that she had won. And then, just as James had taught me, I would look her in the eye. I would speak the truth, calmly, quietly, and I would present the real deed. Then I would let the silence do the work. I put the folder back on the passenger seat. But its weight had changed. It was no longer a heavy burden, but a perfectly balanced tool. I was no longer a victim reacting to a crisis. I was a strategist, a general with a clear and simple plan of engagement. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the grieving widow. I was Ellie, James's Ellie, and I was going home to protect my sunshine. I turned the key. The engine purred to life. A low sonnet, unsteady sound, as I pulled out of the lakeside lot and onto the road leading back to my house. I wasn't driving into a confrontation. I was driving toward a conclusion. Part 6. The chess match begins. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sound of my tires seemed unnaturally loud, a signal of my return. Through the large living room window, I could see the shapes of people turning toward the sound. The game was about to begin. I switched off the ignition and took one last deep breath. I did not gather grocery bags or a purse. I reached over and picked up the single manila folder from the passenger seat. That was all I carried as I walked up the porch steps. My back straight, my chin level. The screen door groaned open and then slammed shut behind me. The blare of the television was the first casualty of my arrival. Someone muted it, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled with a thick, watchful silence. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on me. And then on the folder in my hand. They had been expecting provisions for their party. I had returned with a reckoning. Jennifer was the first to speak. Her voice edged with a forced brightness. "Mom, you were gone a while. We were starting to get worried." "There was no need to worry," I said. My voice was calm. I walked past her to the small entryway table, the one where they'd left a wet ring on the antique wood. I placed the folder down. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, definitive thud, but it echoed in the silent room. "I'm home now." I looked at them. For the first time, I truly saw them. Not as a grieving mother sees her child. Not as a lonely woman sees a house full of company. I saw them as a woman defending her territory. They felt it. I know they did. The casual, sprawling postures tightened. The lazy smiles faded. I'm not cooking a big meal tonight, I announced to the room. There are leftovers from yesterday in the refrigerator. You can help yourselves. It was a declaration of war disguised as a dinner announcement. The shock was palpable. For 2 days, I had been their short-order cook, their maid, their concierge. That person was gone. The meal was a surreal affair. They picked at the cold chicken and leftover potato salad with a strange timidity. The usual raucous laughter was replaced by the clinking of forks and nervous coughs. Michael's Aunt Carol, who had complained about the lack of dessert, now ate her food in complete silence. Her eyes darting between me and my daughter. Jennifer sat opposite me, pushing food around her plate. She was trying to read me, trying to find the broken, pliable mother she had left a few hours ago. She couldn't. That woman was no longer at the table. Finally, she could stand the tension no longer. So, she began, her practiced smile firmly in place. Did you get everything sorted out at the bank? Mom, it was the move I had been waiting for. The probing question, designed to confirm my obedience. I didn't look up from my plate. I carefully cut a small piece of chicken. I got done what needed to be done, I replied. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was an answer that was not an answer. A wall she could not see, but could most certainly feel. The silence that followed was different. It was heavier. I could feel Michael's gaze on me from the head of the table. It was a palpable force, a challenge. Slowly, I lifted my head and met his eyes. What he was expecting, I don't know. Tears, anger, the watery, grief-stricken eyes of a woman he could easily manipulate. What he got was something else. He was looking into the eyes of James Vance's wife. He was looking at 69 years of life, of love, of loss, and of a promise I now intended to keep. He saw not a victim, but a protector. He saw steel, a flicker of something panic. Maybe. Or just pure shock crossed his face. The bravado he wore like a cheap suit dissolved. He was the first to look away. Check. I finished my small meal, placed my fork and knife neatly on the plate, and stood up. It's been a long day, I said to the silent, watching room. I'm going to bed. I turned and walked toward my bedroom, the one Jennifer and Michael were occupying. I didn't have to say another word. They watched me go. And in the suffocating silence I left behind, they knew, just as I did, that the game had changed. The battle was not only inevitable, it was already underway, and I was ready. Part 7. The Indecent Proposal. I didn't go to the master bedroom. I went to the small guest room, the one with the single twin bed, where I had been sleeping for the past 2 nights. I left the door slightly ajar. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress. A deliberate portrait of a defeated woman. I didn't have to wait long. Footsteps followed me down the hall. Jennifer appeared in the doorway first. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of concern. Michael loomed behind her, filling the frame, his arms crossed, his patience clearly gone. The chess match was over. This was the endgame, Mom. Jennifer began, her voice soft and syrupy. The voice she used when she wanted something. We need to talk. We're all worried about you. You're not acting like yourself. I looked up at her, my gaze watery and unfocused. I let my shoulders slump. I'm just tired. Jennifer? So very tired. We know you are, she said, stepping into the room. Michael stayed in the doorway, a silent, imposing guard. And that's why we have to sort this out, so you don't have to worry anymore. She sat beside me on the bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. She took my hand. It was cold. Mom, Michael and I are in some trouble, some financial trouble. It's very bad. I let a long silence hang in the air, playing my part. I looked down at our hands. What kind of trouble? I whispered. Michael's voice cut in from the doorway, sharp and devoid of any pretense. We took out a business loan we can't pay back. Eleanor, they're going to start seizing our assets. The house, the cars, everything. This was it. The moment of truth. I pulled my hand from Jennifer's and wrung it in my lap. I made myself look small. I made my voice tremble. "Oh, my dear," I said, the words catching in my throat. I don't know what to say. I don't have any money to give you. The house is all I have left." Jennifer's eyes, which had been feigning sympathy, sharpened. She saw an opening. "We know, Mom. We're not asking for money." She squeezed my arm, her grip surprisingly tight. "We just need you to help us secure a new loan. A small one, just until we get back on our feet." How, I asked? My voice a breathy whisper. "How can I help with that?" "By using the house as collateral," Michael said bluntly from the door. I recoiled. A physical flinch that was only half acting. The sheer audacity of it, said so plainly, was still a shock. "The house," I stammered. But this house it's all I have of your father. It's supposed to be my home for the rest of my life." Jennifer's face crumpled. The real performance was about to begin. Tears, big and theatrical, welled in her eyes and began to stream down her cheeks. "Mom, please," she wailed, her voice rising in pitch. "Don't you understand? I'm going to lose everything. Our home, the kids will have nowhere to live. You're our only hope. Are you really going to sit here in this big, empty house while your own daughter, your own grandchildren, are thrown out onto the street?" It was a masterful guilt trip. I had to admit, decades of practice had perfected her craft. I shook my head, my feigned confusion hardening into a flicker of resistance. I don't know. "Jennifer, this is all that your father left for me," my voice trailed off. And I saw it. I saw the flash of predatory light in my daughter's eyes. She knew she was winning. That's when Michael lost the last of his patience. He stepped into the room, his shadow falling over both of us. His voice was low and menacing. "Eleanor, this is not the time to be sentimental," he said, the word "mom" conspicuously absent. "We are a family, and this house is more than big enough to help everyone. It's selfish to keep it all to yourself when your family is drowning. You have an obligation. You are going to help us. That's final." The threat was clear. The mask was completely off. This was not a request. It was a demand. They stood there, my daughter and her husband, a united front of entitlement and greed. Waiting for my final surrender, I let the silence stretch, filling the small room until it was buzzing with tension. I let them see my shoulders shake. I looked from Jennifer's tear-stained, triumphant face to Michael's hard, impatient glare. I took a shuddering breath. Then, slowly, I lifted my head, my eyes red and seemingly defeated. "All right," I whispered, the word cracking with manufactured grief. "You're right. You're my family." I paused, letting them savor their victory. Let me go get the deed. I can feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on my back as I walk. They think they've won, but they have no idea that I'm not going to get what they think I am. If you're still listening, please help me by commenting with courage below, just so I know my friends are still with me on this journey. Your presence is the greatest encouragement for me to tell the final part of this fateful night. Part 8, The Real Deed. My footsteps were the only sound in the house as I walked from the guest room back to the entryway table. I picked up the manila folder. It felt warm in my hands, alive with the power of my husband's love. I didn't return to the small room. Instead, I walked into the living room, where all 20 of them were now gathered. A silent, expectant jury. Jennifer and Michael stood in the center, their faces a mixture of greed and impatience. I opened the folder. With a hand that was now perfectly steady, I drew out a single sheet of paper, a copy of a standard quitclaim deed Arthur had printed for me. Completely blank and unsigned. I held it out. "This is it, isn't it?" I asked, my voice still holding a trace of its earlier tremble. "This is what you need." Jennifer didn't walk. She lunged. She snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes scanning it with a feverish intensity. A huge, shuddering sob of relief escaped her lips. She clutched the worthless piece of paper to her chest as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "Oh, Mom, thank you," she cried, turning and throwing her arms around Michael. "We're saved. I told you she'd do the right thing. She just needed a little push." Michael wrapped his arms around her, a wide, smug grin spreading across his face. He looked over her shoulder at me and gave a short, triumphant nod, a king acknowledging a compliant subject. Around the room, the tense silence broke into a wave of relieved chatter and murmurs. His family began to smile, already celebrating their reprieve, their free vacation saved, their financial anchor secured. I let them have it. A full 5 seconds of victory. I let them bathe in the glow of their successful conquest. I watched the pure, unadulterated joy on my daughter's face as she believed she had successfully cornered and broken her own mother. Then, into their celebration, I spoke. My voice was different now. All the trembling was gone. It was as calm, clear, and cold as the water at the bottom of a deep well. That, I said, my voice cutting through their chatter like a shard of glass, is the paper your father told me to make sure I never, ever signed. The smiles froze. The laughter died in their throats. Jennifer's head snapped toward me, her face a mask of confusion. I reached back into the manila folder. This time, I pulled out the real document, the thick stack of notarized pages, held together by a sturdy clasp, bearing the official seal of Caldwell and Sons, attorneys at law. I walked to the coffee table, the one with the wet ring on it, and I placed the document down. The sound, a soft thwack of heavy paper on wood, echoed through the suddenly cavernous silence of the room like a gunshot. And this, I announced, my voice ringing with an authority none of them had ever heard from me before, is the real deed. I let them stare at it. I watched the confusion on their faces curdle into dawning horror. Michael was the first to understand, his face going pale. "What is that?" Jennifer stammered, taking a step forward. "That," I said, tapping the cover page with my index finger, "is the founding document of the James T. Vance Irrevocable Trust. Your father set it up before he died. This house is the sole asset of that trust, and I am the sole trustee, which means, Jennifer, that this house cannot be sold. It cannot be used as collateral. It cannot be transferred. Its ownership cannot be touched by anyone, for any reason, as long as I am alive. Legally," I paused, letting the words sink in. "It is a fortress, and I am the one holding the key." Jennifer's face went from white to a blotchy, furious red. The worthless paper she was holding fluttered from her hand to the floor. "No," she whispered. "No, you're lying. Dad would never do that. He would never cut me out." "He didn't cut you out, darling," I said, my voice softening for just a moment with a genuine, aching sadness. "He named you as the sole beneficiary. The house is yours the day after I'm gone. He just made sure I would have a home until then. He made sure I would be safe." "Safe from who?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Safe from me. His own daughter. Dad would be so disappointed in you right now." That was the final blow, the one she thought would shatter me. But instead, it filled me with the last ounce of strength I needed. I looked my daughter in the eye, the baby I had once held, the woman she had become, and I spoke the hardest, truest words of my life. The love I had for her was still there, but it was now protected by the stronger, older love I had for the man who had seen this day coming. "No, Jennifer," I said, my voice steady, filled with the weight of 45 years of marriage. "Your father would be proud, because today, I am finally doing the one thing he always knew I would have to do someday." I held her gaze. "I'm protecting myself from you." Silence. It crashed down upon the room, absolute and suffocating. It was heavier than grief, louder than any shout. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. The 20 members of Michael's family stood like statues, their faces etched with shock and dawning shame. Michael stared at the document on the table as if it were a venomous snake. And Jennifer just stood there, her mouth slightly open. All the fight, all the lies, all the entitlement, finally, blessedly, silenced. In that moment, standing in my quiet living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my daughter's greed, I finally understood. The title of my story wasn't about them going quiet. It was about me finally finding the strength to make them listen to my silence. Part 9. The Ashes of the Storm. The silence held. It was a tangible thing. A thick, heavy blanket that smothered all sound. No one shouted. No one argued. My final words, the truth of my husband's foresight, had done what no amount of screaming ever could. It had left nothing more to be said. It did not break with a scream or a sob, but with the quiet, shuffling sound of a single person clearing their throat. It was Michael's Uncle Gene. He picked up his wife's sweater from the back of a chair, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, refusing to look at me, at Jennifer, at anyone. That one small movement was the signal. The spell was broken. They left not with a bang, but with a whisper. The exodus was a slow, deeply awkward affair. It was the sound of zippers being pulled on suitcases that had been unpacked with boisterous joy just days before. It was the sound of car keys being fished out of pockets. It was the sound of soft footsteps on the oak floors. Everyone suddenly terrified of making a sound, of drawing attention to themselves. They moved like ghosts. These people who had so recently acted as if they owned the place. They gathered their children, their coolers, their duffel bags, their faces burning with a quiet, profound shame. Not a single one of them met my eye. They were accomplices in a failed coup. And now, they just wanted to disappear. The first SUV started, its engine a roar in the quiet evening, and pulled away down the gravel road. Then the next, and the next. Soon, only Jennifer, Michael, and their 2 children were left, standing amidst the debris of their failed invasion. Michael looked utterly defeated, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. He couldn't look at me. He just herded his children toward their car, his hand on their backs. I stood by the front door, simply watching. There was no triumph in my heart, no surge of victory, only a vast, aching sadness. I had won. I had saved my home, my peace, my future, but the price had been the last, tattered remnants of the relationship I thought I had with my daughter. A mother's victory should never feel this much like a loss. Jennifer was the last one to the door. She stopped a few feet away from me, her arms wrapped around herself. Her face was pale and puffy. All the fight drained out of her. She looked small. She looked, for the first time in years, like my child. She didn't apologize. I knew she wouldn't. The wound was too fresh, her humiliation too complete. An apology would require a self-awareness she didn't yet possess. Instead, she just looked at me, her eyes filled with a complicated storm of anger, shame, even a bit of malice, in Respirian self, and a sliver of something that might have been regret. "I'll call you," she said, her voice a raw, broken whisper. It wasn't a promise. It was a question, a fragile acknowledgement that a bridge had been burned, and neither of us knew if it could ever be rebuilt. I just nodded once. That was all. It was everything that could be said. She turned and walked to her car, getting in without a backward glance. I watched as the final pair of red taillights disappeared into the darkness, the crunch of the last tires on the gravel fading into the sound of the crickets. And then, I was alone. I closed the front door, the click of the latch sounding final and absolute. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the cool plaster walls. James's armchair was still shoved in a corner. The coffee table still had a wet ring on it. The house was a mess, a testament to the storm that had just passed. But it was quiet. It was a new kind of silence. Not the hopeful silence of my first morning, nor the terrible, tense silence of the confrontation. This was an empty peace, a silence that was truly, completely mine. It was the silence of the rest of my life. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the trust document, the real deed. It felt solid and true in my hands. I held it to my chest, and I could almost feel my James's hand, his thumb tracing slow, comforting circles over my knuckles. Outside, the Georgia pines stood tall and silent, like old sentinels, my sentinels, guarding my peace. And for the first time since he left me, I felt like I could breathe again, deeply, all the way down to the bottom of my lung. Part 10. The Garden Reborn. 6 months have passed since that night. The Georgia seasons have turned, and the raw, wounded earth of winter has given way to the determined green of spring. My little house, once a battlefield, is now a home, a sanctuary. The silence that first greeted me in the aftermath of the storm has been filled, not with noise, but with life. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the whistling of the kettle, the contented hum of my own thoughts. I spend most of my mornings outside now, in the garden. When I first arrived, it was a neglected tangle of weeds and thorns, much like my own spirit. But my neighbor, Betty, came over one day with a pair of gloves and a trowel, and together, we began to work. We pulled out the bitter roots, tilled the soil, and planted new seeds. The garden has taught me something. Sometimes, you have to prune the dead branches, no matter how painful it feels, to make room for new life to push through. It's a lesson that costs you something, but the reward is the bloom that follows. My friendship with Betty has been one of those blooms. We sit on my porch most afternoons, drinking iced tea, talking about everything and nothing. She never asks about what happened that night, but she knows. It's in the quiet way she'll put her hand on my arm when I'm staring off into the distance. It's the simple companionship of a woman who understands that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one can see. The most tender new growth, however, has appeared in the place I least expected it. There's a single rose bush in the corner of the garden. An old, hardy specimen that James planted years ago at our first house and transplanted with every move. It was struggling when I got here, overgrown and weak. I've been tending to it carefully, feeding it, trimming away the suckers that drain its strength. As I worked on it one afternoon, I finally understood the heart of my husband's last lesson. I learned that loving your children doesn't mean letting them grow like wild vines that choke the very life from you. True love, the kind that lasts, is about teaching them how to root themselves firmly in the soil of their own lives. Jennifer called last week. For months, our conversations were stiff and awkward. Brief check-ins that skirted the massive, unspoken chasm between us. But this time was different. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't complain or make demands. After a moment of quiet, she asked, "How are Dad's roses doing?" I told her about the first deep red bud that was about to open. I described the way the morning sun hit the leaves. And for the first time in a very long time, we just talked. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was something smaller. But perhaps more important, it was a beginning. And in that moment, I realized that respect isn't something you can demand. It's a fragile seed that can only sprout when it's planted in the soil of responsibility, not entitlement. Perhaps, just perhaps, her own long winter is coming to an end. Betty and I were watching the sunset yesterday. The sky painted in strokes of orange and purple. We were talking about the world, about how it always seems to be rushing, shouting at you to get more, be bigger, do more. How easy it is to get lost in that noise. This little house at the end of a gravel road is my stand against that noise. It is not an asset to be leveraged. It is a legacy. And the most precious legacy James left me wasn't the thick folder of trust documents, but the lessons sealed within them, the lesson of dignity, the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. That is something no bank can ever put a price on, and something no one can ever take from you. Right now, I am sitting in James's worn leather armchair, right by the window where the afternoon sun is warmest. A cup of tea is steaming in my hands. I'm looking out at my garden, at the vibrant reds and yellows and greens, at the promise of new life taking hold. That first rose on James's old bush has finally opened, and I am smiling. So, Eleanor's garden has been reborn, and our story comes to a close here. What a journey it's been, hasn't it? What lingers in my mind the most is that fragile line between love and sacrifice, the kind that makes you lose yourself. Do you see a part of yourself? Or someone you know? In Eleanor's story, let's talk in the comments. I would truly love to hear your story. If this story warmed your heart, share that warmth with a like, and by passing it along, and if you'd like to walk alongside many more stories like this one. Subscribing to Dipucator Stories will keep us connected. Take care of yourself. And we'll meet again soon in another story. Who knows, maybe it's happening right beside you.